I don't know how to feel after that music either. It's not. Welcome to the game show this morning. I don't know. Not sure. Hey, if we haven't met before, my name's Brandon Evans. I'm the campus pastor out at our Mat-Su campus, and I am super stoked to be here with you guys at our Raspberry campus. I know a couple of my Mat-Suites, I think that's what I call it, showed up this morning. Where are you guys? Where are you? Come on, you said you'd woo. Give me something. There they are. Come on. That's all the Mat-Su gets right there. It's just 3 claps, okay? Jason, Nicole, I'm glad you guys are here. As we step into our message this morning, I just want to share a quick little story. It was 2004, and a man by the name of Hal Becker was about to have a life-altering moment of conviction. He was just wrapping up his time at Kohl's, and as he stood in the ridiculously long line, as it always is at Kohl's, he was watching total chaos unfold right before his eyes. He was watching a dad with 2 boys, and these 2 boys were boys to the max. And what I mean by that was this dad was in the process of checking out, and his boys were grabbing all of the candy bars and throwing them on the ground. And these boys were hanging on the guardrail that lines, the line at Kohl's. They were screaming at the cashier and pulling on their dad's shirt. And Hal was standing right behind him thinking, what in the world is going on? Giving the boys dirty looks, giving the dad dirty looks. And finally, the father and his boys checked out. They finished at the register, and it was Hal's turn. And he was so ready to ask the cashier a simple question. How in the world could anyone not care so much? How in the world could anyone not care about what their boys were doing to let their kids act like that? But before he even got out his question, the cashier immediately said, "Sir, thank you so much for your patience. You wouldn't believe the story I just heard. You see, that guy just told me that they came here right after their mom's funeral. She's had cancer for months. She was in hospice care for weeks, and the funeral was today." And now they were wandering the store, and before he knew it, the cashier knew it, this dad handed him his debit card and said, "Please, if my boys have caused any problems, if they stole anything, if they broke anything, please just charge it to my card without question. But I don't have the heart in this moment to stop them from laughing and smiling. It's the first time I've seen them play together in weeks." And Hal left the store with his head drooped. I mean, we've all had stories like that, haven't we, Change Point? We've all had moments like that where we put our foot directly in our mouth without even knowing it. We've all had moments where we fully believe we know what's actually going on, but in reality, we literally have zero idea what's going on in the situation. More practically, what goes through our minds when we notice our friend hug the other guests at the party, but they skip right over us? What goes through our minds when our friends have an inside joke that we don't get to be a part of? What goes through our minds when someone who normally returns our call or text all of a sudden doesn't? What goes through our mind when our spouse doesn't kiss us goodbye like they normally do and normally would? What goes through our minds in these moments? You see, as we've been discussing, God has given us an inner guidance system for our lives. He has given us thinking. He's given us feeling. He's given us depth, hasn't he? He's given us this thing called emotions, but the challenge for us, church family, is to actually know our emotions. Not to simply respond to them, certainly not to simply react with them, but to know them. And as you've already heard time and time again in this series, we need to know our emotions so that we're no longer controlled by them, and so we can fully engage with God and those around us. You with me? We need to know our emotions so that we're no longer controlled by them, and so we can fully engage with God and those around us. Now there's one thing. Past couple weeks we talked about sudden outbursts, these things called icebergs, right? How many of you have had an iceberg moment in the past couple weeks? Come on, be honest. Okay, just me, I guess. We're good with that. There's one thing that routinely pokes and prods our icebergs. There's one thing that continually pulls out these sudden emotional outbursts that we have no clue where they're coming from. You want to know the one thing? we don't know everything. We don't know everything, but the problem is we think we do, don't we? We don't know everything, but the problem is we think we do. Only God is omniscient. Only God knows all things about all situation. God alone knows what's going on in the minds of others. Yet over and over again, just like Hal in the Coles line, we play God by taking the authorship of someone else's story and running with that story in our minds. Tracking with me? We play God over and over again by perceiving what's going on in a situation, judging the people based upon not reality, but based upon our perception, and then we run and we create a story, just like Hal. You see, the skill we're talking about today is about as straightforward as it gets. In order to continue developing our people skills, church family, we have to stop mind reading. In order to continue to develop our people skills, we have to stop mind reading. Why? Because healthy relationships require us to live in the story and actually let God write it. Healthy relationships require us to have the faith enough in God to simply live in the story and let God write the story. The problem of the day is simple. The assumptions we make or the stories we write about other people have enormous impact on our feelings. Hopefully a name you know by now, Pete Scazzero, the guy who developed all this emotionally healthy material, he puts it this way: when a friend arrives for lunch 40 minutes late, what's the felt emotional difference between our mind assuming he or she was in a car accident or he or she doesn't value the relationship as much as I do? Where does your mind go initially, and what is the felt emotional difference? Why is there such a drastic difference? Pete Scazzero says this: because our feelings are closely related to the story we tell ourselves about the things going on around us. Let me say that again. Our feelings, our emotions, are closely related to the story we tell ourselves about the things going on around us. So as we move forward this morning, I want to journey together into two realities of this problem and one solution that solves it. You with me on that? All right, reality number one. We all think we're mind readers. You see the asterisks around think, right? We all think we're mind readers. One thing is absolutely true about humanity. We love stories, don't we? Don't we? We love stories, whether it be Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, The Great Gatsby, or The Odyssey. We all fall for narrative somewhere in our story of life. Why do you think stories were the primary way of communicating a truth for centuries and centuries and centuries? Why do you think Jesus unveiled this radical new way of getting his point across? Parables, these stories that connected to life. A doctor of leadership on the power of story, Dr. Jim Lohr, says this: the best leaders, teachers, and coaches are the best storytellers. Story inspires, motivates, and challenges and engages our passion more than anyone else can. And he continues with this profound thought: the private voice, the inner voice, the voice inside that no one hears, is a master storyteller. Does that connect with any of you? Your inner voice, your voice that is thinking and perceiving every situation that's going on around you, is actually a master storyteller, whether you want it to be or not. And what that means is that we're very often taking the job of author from God and telling ourselves stories about other people that simply aren't true. Don't forget the story of Hal already, right? He ran with a perception and then was living off of a story that wasn't true. We make assumptions that damage our friendships, our marriages, our workplace relationships, and our parental influence. The Pharisees fell into this trap over and over again with Jesus in mind, didn't they? Think about the Pharisees and their total inability to ever see any good in Jesus, no matter what he did. Jesus couldn't fit into their system, so they simply didn't believe that he was the Messiah, and they acted accordingly over and over and over again. Picture it with me. Could you imagine not even caring about Jesus restoring someone's eyesight simply because he did it on the Sabbath? And that added to their story. Could you imagine spending your time coming up with questions to try and trick or trap Jesus, missing every single opportunity you had to engage with the Messiah? Concocting everything you could to be against the one who came in human form to be so ferociously for. You see, they were constantly mind reading the thoughts, the ideas, and the perceptions of Jesus. Their mind reading, their assumptions about who Jesus was staged them against the one who was so ferociously for. Here's the question: what's the story of your inner voice? What's the story of your inner voice this morning? Real potentially, it's, man, I'm so tired of my kids because I was screaming at them the whole ride here, right? That's a reality. What's the story of your inner voice? Are people constantly against you? Does disagreement equal shame or pride? Are your assumptions of others more often for them, or are your assumptions of others more often against them and for yourself? Are others ever the main character, or is it always about you? Now, I don't think I have to spend any more time on this idea to convince you any further in the reality that we're all mind readers, that we're constantly making assumptions about the perceived reality of other people and acting upon them. Reality number one is that we all think we're mind readers. Now, reality number two is that mind reading causes problems. Mind reading causes problems. Husbands, look at me. I'm going to get you to admit something really dangerous here. Have you ever tried to finish your wife's statement in the middle of a fight? Like, you won't even raise your hand at that point. Your wives are raising their hands. I see it. I'll say it again. Mind reading causes problems, doesn't it? When we assume the reality and act upon that reality, we're stepping into dangerous ground. And here's the hard truth: when we leave reality for our own concoction of reality, we're actually living and acting in our own created counterfeit world. You with me on that? When we trade what's actually going on for our perceived reality of what's going on, we're acting and living in our own made-up, imagination-created world. Talk about a recipe for confusion, right? What damage came when Peter assumed it was his job to defend Jesus and cut off a dude's ear? What damage came in that moment, other than an ear on the ground, which is pretty gross? What damage came when the disciples assumed the man born blind in John chapter 9 was blind because of sin, rather than just he was born with an ailment? What damage came when Judas assumed the woman wasted that perfume on the feet of Jesus, and it continued to help him write his own story in his mind? What damage came when the disciples assumed that Jesus died for good and they were hiding in a basement with the doors locked, not knowing what was next? Maybe more practically, what damage came when you assumed your son or your daughter was intentionally disobeying you, but in reality they just couldn't hear? That actually happened to me. We found out my daughter's ears were packed full of fluid when she kept saying, "I can't hear you," and we said, "Yes, you can." No, she couldn't. Don't call on me for that one, please. What damage came when you assumed your coworker offered up a new idea to compete with yours, but really they just missed the meeting where you proposed your idea and they were trying to help? What damage came when you assumed your spouse was against you in that last quote-unquote heated discussion, but really they're just genuinely hurt by something? What damage came when you assumed you know everything about the person who voted for the candidate other than who you voted for, but in reality, you don't? You see, we've all experienced this, but acting upon our assumptions and self-authored stories continually wreck relationships by creating endless confusion and conflict. And there's two main reasons to that. Why does that happen? Well, first, because the assumptions of others break the ninth commandment. Our assumptions of others actually break the ninth commandment. We often fail to see how relationally driven the 10 commandments are, and this is just one example. Exodus chapter 20, verse 16. Exodus 20:16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. I'll say it again, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, oftentimes we hear this verse and we think perjury or lying under oath, which is true, but it also has another deep and very, very interpersonal application. Listen, every time we run with our made-up story about someone else, we are bearing false witness to ourselves about who they actually are. You with me? Every time we run with a made-up story in our minds about someone else, we're actually bearing false witness about who they are to ourselves. You see, every time we read the minds of people who hurt or disappointed us without confirming it, we believe a lie that we've constructed in our own heads about this individual. You see, our minds are breaking the ninth commandment by bearing false witness about someone else to ourselves. Secondly, assumptions wreck and confuse relationships because they cause us to lean in the wrong direction. Our assumptions cause us to lean in the wrong direction. A passage most of you have probably heard before, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not, or do not lean on your own understanding. Church family, I need you to talk back to me here. What are we doing when we follow an assumption or act out on an assumption that we've concocted in our mind? What are we doing? We're acting on our own understanding, aren't we? I tell you what we're not doing is asking them their perception of the situation. We're not asking God to give us grace and help us understand. No, we're just acting on our own understanding. Our mind reading and assumptions prove our quickness to lean into our own understandings, our own perspectives, and our own experiences, to believe that we actually have perceived the situation with 100% accuracy. Has that ever happened in your life before, if you're honest? Perceived a situation with 100% accuracy? Once again, not trusting the Lord to write the story, we take the reins of authorship ourselves, and we run with a story that we've concocted in our minds. To wrap this point up, Andy Stanley wrote, we don't drift, or I match that with the word assume. We don't assume into good directions. We discipline and prioritize ourselves there. Assuming will almost always take us into dangerous ground because we're acting on our own concoction, our own imagination-created reality. Assumptions lead to dangerous places. So reality number one, we all think we're mind readers. Reality number two, mind reading causes problems. Now, how in the world do we solve this relational nightmare? If this is something we're doing, basically whether we know it or not, and if it's something we're doing and it's causing problems day in and day out, how in the world do we solve this problem? I don't mean to be redundant here, but the solution is simple. Stop making assumptions. Start asking questions. Stop making assumptions and start asking questions. I want to look at what Solomon writes on this topic, Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs 18, verse 2, 13, and 15. It says this, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding. Say that again. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his own opinion. I'll let that sit for a moment. Verse 13, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and his shame. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and his shame. Now verse 15, an intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. According to Solomon, how often do we play the role of the fool? According to Solomon, how often do we play the role of the fool? You know, I know far too often I value spitting out my own opinion quickly, before I value actually sitting and hearing the felt reality of someone else. It's a tough thing. It's when we feel that our spouse disrespects us. It's when we feel that our friend betrays us. It's when we feel that work abuses us that we're challenged to decide the next couple relational moments. You see, are we going to assume that our perception is correct? And are we going to mind read the situation accordingly? Or are we going to get clarity by pausing long enough to ask a couple simple questions? When we feel betrayed, when we feel abused, when we feel disrespected or rejected, are we going to assume that our perception is correct? Or are we going to care enough about the relationship in front of us to pause and ask some questions about what might be going on? You see, I want to suggest perhaps a new angle of looking at a passage that many of us have read before. Look at it with me, Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. It says this, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the log that's in your own? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye?" That's supposed to be a little comical there. Verse 5, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Practically speaking, when someone says or does something to us that sets us off a bit, how often do we go judging them unfairly? How often do we run into our perception of the situation before we look inside of ourselves for what temptations, what assumptions, what insecurities, what fears they might have just poked accidentally? Even more practically, how could I possibly expect to take a speck out of your eye, a little tiny branch out of your eye, if I have a tree stump in front of my eye, right? That's the illustration that's being used here. You see, in this passage, I believe that Jesus is actually putting a whole new point across, a point like this, that perception is an invitation to depth, not judgment. That perception is an invitation to depth, not judgment, that the tool of perception is both a blessing and a curse. As we go on our days, day in and day out, we're constantly perceiving things, right? Like Hal in the line at the store, we are looking at a situation and we're just assuming and perceiving what's going on. We're constantly perceiving that things that either encourage a relationship or discourage a relationship. We're either going to dive into depth based on our perception, or we're going to rush to judgment based on our perception. But perception, not being a tool used to rush to quick conclusions about other people, actually gives us an opportunity to experience two new things, or depth in two realms. First, depth with ourselves. First, we get to experience depth with ourselves. Questions like, why am I feeling this way? Questions like, why did that little text they sent me just set me off so quickly? What made me react so quickly? Why do I feel the need to defend myself in this moment? Do you ever ask yourselves those questions before you open your mouth? You see, questions like this give us the opportunity to begin to actually know ourselves and understand why we're reacting the way we are. Remember the challenge of Jesus. First, take the log out of your own eye. Then you can have a conversation about the small branch in someone else's. One more point on depth of self. Oftentimes we rush into quick conversations, even maybe slightly with the right motive of trying to find answers. But our need to find answers reveals something else about us. Why in the world do we need to know if my friend was trying to poke an iceberg or not? Why in the world do we constantly feel the need to defend ourselves? If we're truly living in the story, and if we're truly trusting God and letting Him tell the story, then we'll trust Him enough to not worry about ourselves, but to dive deeper into relationship and to trust that God is using it as a tool for depth, not necessarily simply for me to defend myself. So first, perception gives us the opportunity to experience depth of self. Secondly, to experience depth with others. This might be new news for you, but did you know, this is scientifically proven, did you know you could actually be wrong in your assumptions? Did you know that? My wife told me that the other day. It was shocking. You could be that guy in the store staring at a dad with his two sons, assuming the situation and having no clue what the actual felt reality is. You see, in the ups, downs, and storms of relationship, we're given one of the greatest gifts in the world, the chance to actually know someone else's story, right? What changes in the moments between Hal assuming what's going on in that guy's life and Hal actually learning what's going on in that guy's life and hearing someone else's story? His life is now impacted, right? You see, the further we dive into relationship, the further we can actually see God moving through the story of other people, where our judgments bring death, where our assumptions bring death. Asking questions brings life and encouragement. Could you imagine what could happen if instead of saying to your spouse, "Why are you so sad all the time?" Husbands, don't ever say that to your wives. Instead of saying that, you asked a simple question, "I see your tears. Could you tell me about them?" Could you imagine what would happen if instead of condemning your child who just stormed down the hall and slammed the door, look, I've been there, instead of condemning them, you stooped down on one knee and you said, "Could you tell me about how you're feeling right now? What is going on in your little heart?" Instead of chewing out your employee for a new pattern of showing up late, you asked simply, "Are there any problems going on that I need to be aware of? Are there any problems taking place that I can step in and help with?" You see, perception. I perceived my 4-year-old daughter storming down the hall and slamming the door. Perception is an invitation for her to experience depth with her dad. For me to care for her and hear more of her story and care enough to ask what's going on in her heart. Perception is an invitation to depth, not judgment. And depth requires that you ask questions, first of yourself and then second of others. So starting to wind down here, there are two realities to the problem of mind reading in relationship. Reality number one, we all think we can do it. We all think we can mind read. We know we do it all the time, and the problem is we actually think we're right in the midst of our doing it. Reality number one, we all think we can do it. Reality number two, our attempts to do it cause problems way more than we think we do. Because we're wrong about our assumptions and our judgments and our mind reading way more than we think we are. So what's the solution? Well, stop thinking that everyone else's story is all about you. You hear me? I need to stop thinking that your story is all about me. I need to stop thinking that everything you say to me, I'm the main character in that situation. Your story is about you, not about me. Stop thinking everyone else's story is all about you. Stop making assumptions and start asking questions. Embrace the beautiful gift that you've been given to know someone else's story. So what can we do this week to start living this skill out? First, as simple as it may sound, the challenge is to avoid assumptions. Avoid assumptions. The only way to do this is to assess your values, to ask questions, and to seek multiple perspectives before you open your big mouth. That we would ask questions, that we would assess our values, that we would seek multiple perspectives before we open up our big mouths and assume that our story is correct. My challenge starting today, partner with your spouse, partner with a friend in calling one another out on your assumptions. Number one, avoid assumptions. Secondly, believe the best. Believe the best. How many of your assumptions are for the benefit of someone else? How many of your assumptions are for the death, the downfall of someone else? I don't know about you, maybe it's more revealing to me than it is to you, but man, my assumptions are way often more against than they are for, right? Our assumptions are way more, the glass is almost empty, not nearly full. But 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 7 says this: love bears all things, it hopes all things, believes all things, and endures all things. Look at that phrase, it hopes all things. Do you have hope about humanity? Do you have hope about your marriage? Do you have hope about your friendships? Do you have hope for your coworkers? Change Point. It's time that we have hope in people. Again, let's not forget that even the people we feel wronged us, abused us, disrespected us, are made in the beautiful image of God, aren't they? It's time we have hope for people again. Stop assuming the worst and start believing the best, and I promise you, you'll be able to watch immediately how it begins to heal your relationships, how it begins to bring hope to your entire life. First, avoid assumptions. Second, believe the best. And thirdly, value the story of others. Value the story of others. This might be the hardest one of the three. You know why? In order to value someone else's story, what do we have to do? You have to care. In order to value someone else's story, you actually have to care about that person as another human with a soul who's going through the hardship of life. The less you care about people, the less you'll care about their story, and the more you'll care about your own opinion. Let me say that again. The less you care about people, the less you'll care about their story, and the more you'll care about your own opinion on whatever you have perceived at that time. But look at what Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. Church, this should be an encouragement and a challenge to all of us in this room. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Verse 4, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. You see the heart of avoiding assumptions, believing the best, and valuing the story in that challenge. Listen, when we avoid assumptions, church family, when we believe the best and when we value the story of other people's, I promise, we too, you too, we as Change Point Alaska, being for life in Christ, for every Alaskan and the world beyond, we too will be loving people like Jesus. Let me pray. Jesus, thank you so much for your word, and thank you for the gift you've given us of other people. God, would you routinely help us get over ourselves? Would you routinely, Lord, help me get over myself? Don't let me ever think that I am the main character in this grand story called life, but humanity, Lord, is the character in the story of life. And we have an awesome gift to interact with each other, to talk about the difficulties, the joys, and the pains, and the sorrows of life with one another, to grow and sharpen one another. But Lord, often we put up boundaries, we put up hurdles, we put up hardships that aren't even reality. They're just some form of an imagination creation. God, right now, since we as a church love people so deeply, I pray that you would challenge us and that your Spirit would remind us constantly to first avoid assumptions, to not run with the ideas, the seeds that might be planted in our minds. Lord, to start believing the best. You have created a good thing. You have created a good people. And we have hope that you are working, and we believe that you are moving. So Lord, help us believe the best. And thirdly, just as you did, King Jesus, when you wept, even though you were about to call Lazarus out of the tomb, you valued the story of all of those people who were mourning and filled with sorrow. Lord, help us be known in the state as a church that values the story of other people. And through those things, may we begin to love people like you did, Jesus. We love you, we thank you, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.